When I was a child, my uncle was like a shadow I didn't even know I had, a presence lingering in the background, always kind, always generous. To the rest of the family, he was the dependable Uncle Darren, the man who could fix anything, the uncle who showed up at birthday parties with a wry smile and familiar gifts. But there were things about Uncle Darren that I only began to realize as I got older, when I began to notice his gaze lingering just a little longer, a smile that seemed to carry more than just kindness. It was imperceptible, but it was such that a discomfort began to grow inside me, like a splinter I couldn't get out. I want to tell you something that will make you rethink everything I'm about to share. I need you to understand why I hold on to this memory, why it has haunted me for years. But to do that, I'm going to have to take you back to age 24, the year I started to feel something was wrong. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling, it was a feeling of anxiety that clung to me like a second skin, and the more I tried to get rid of it, the more it grew. It was during those months that I moved back in with my parents, needing a place to live while I saved up for my own apartment. Uncle Darren was around a lot back then. He helped my father around the house, fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen, and even offered to drive me to evening classes on days when I didn't feel like taking the bus. I remember those rides, the way his fingers drummed on the steering wheel, the way his gaze shifted to me as he asked questions about how my day was going. At first, these questions seemed like innocent family interest, but then his questions became more personal, about my friends, my relationships, what time I usually got home. They seemed harmless, but there was something about the way he asked that made me worry. The change happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, but then things started to change. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and a sense of unease would come over me, something gnawing at my mind. I felt like someone was watching me. The feeling was so strong it made my skin prickle and my heart pound in my ears. I wrote it off as paranoia. I thought that surely my mind was just playing tricks on me. But the feeling never left me. A suffocating presence settled into my nights. I became afraid to go to bed. The darkness of my room seemed more like a trap than a place of rest. My dreams were filled with shadows, figures that loomed over me, always staying out of reach, and I woke up gasping. One night, as I brushed my teeth in the dim light of the bathroom, I felt someone's gaze on me. It wasn't new anymore, but he seemed heavier, closer. My heart raced, and I turned sharply, half expecting to see my own frightened face staring back at me in the mirror. But at that moment I caught some movement outside the door in the reflection. It came and went before I could be sure, but I knew. I knew it wasn't my imagination. My heart was racing, and I stood there with a toothbrush in my mouth, trying to convince myself that nothing was wrong, that it was just a trick of the eye. But deep down I knew it was for the best. As the days passed, my suspicions grew. My uncle's visits became more frequent, his offers to help, to be there for me seemed more intrusive than comforting. He seemed to be always there, always watching, his eyes following me with a look I couldn't define. His questions became more and more intrusive, about where I was going, who I was meeting, what time I would be back. He seemed to know things he wasn't supposed to know, the small details of my schedule, my habits. I began to feel like there was no place I could go where he wasn't watching me. One night I didn't sleep a wink, holding my breath under the covers. I waited, trying to prove to myself that it wasn't all just fiction. A few hours passed, and just when I thought I might be falling asleep, I heard it. A quiet creak, a quiet shifting of weight behind the door. And then I saw it, a shadow under the door, unmistakable. Uncle Darren was there. I felt a chill throughout my body froze and my mind screamed. I wanted to face him, to swing the door open and demand an explanation, but fear gripped me. What could I say? How could I blame the uncle who had always been there for me, who had always been the pillar of the family? The next morning I watched him across the table at breakfast, his eyes meeting mine with the familiar crooked smile, as if nothing had changed. He asked if I wanted him to look over my car later, and the same warmth he always had came through in his voice. I nodded, my hands trembling under the table. I remember the feeling of betrayal that swept over me, the realization that the man who had always been a part of my life, who had always been there for me, was hiding something so dark, so twisted. The days that followed passed in anxiety and confusion. I started locking the door at night, pulling a chair against it for extra convincing. I avoided being alone with Uncle Darren, making excuses whenever he offered to drive me somewhere or help me with anything. But he noticed. I could see it in his eyes. He knew I was distancing myself, and that only made him even more determined. His presence was like a shadow I couldn't escape. It always lingered, always there, just out of sight. One night I decided I needed proof. I needed something tangible, something to give meaning to the fear that was consuming me. I set my phone to record, placed it on my dresser, and pointed the lens at the door. That night I lay in bed, my heart pounding, every creak of the house making me flinch. Hours passed, I tried to stay awake, but eventually fatigue took its toll. When I woke up the next morning, the phone was still lying untouched. With trembling hands, I picked it up and scrolled through the recording. At first, nothing was visible. Just the darkness of my room, the quiet rustle of the sheets as I tossed and turned in my sleep. And then there it was, the doorknob slowly turning, the door ajar. My breath caught as I watched what was happening. A shadow moved into the room, and only a faint light caught the edge of his face. Uncle Darren. He stood staring at me, his eyes fixed on my sleeping figure. He stood there for what seemed like an eternity, and then he slipped back out quietly, the door closing softly behind him. I felt nauseous, my stomach churning as I stared at the screen. This was reality. Everything I'd felt, every fear, every anxious moment, it was all real. I wasn't making it up. He was watching me, coming into my room at night, standing over me as I slept. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but I was paralyzed by the weight of the truth. What could I do? Who could I tell? How could I explain this without tearing my family apart? The next few days turned into a nightmare. I avoided Uncle Darren as much as possible, but he was always there, always watching. His smiles became even more sinister, his presence even more oppressive. I hardly ate, hardly slept, and the images replayed over and over in my head. I knew I had to do something, but the fear of what might happen if I confronted him kept me silent. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. Every creak of the floorboards made me fearful. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bag quietly, slowly. Every sound made my heart race. I waited until I was sure everyone was asleep and slipped out of the house. I drove for hours, not knowing where I was going. I just needed to get away. I eventually arrived at my friend's house and my hands were shaking as I knocked on her door. She let me in without further question, and I fell into her arms, sobbing profusely. I told her everything, the words tumbling out of me between gasps. She listened, shock and anger reflected on her face, and for the first time in months I felt relieved. I wasn't alone anymore. I need you to understand this. Sometimes the people you trust the most, the ones who are supposed to protect you, hide the darkest secrets. I still see Uncle Darren at family gatherings. He still smiles the same way. His eyes still follow me around the room. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's something darker in me, but I haven't told anyone else. Not my parents, not my cousins, not anyone. I didn't tell them that Uncle Darren doesn't just watch over me, he watches over me. Always watching in the shadows of my life, lurking far away from prying eyes. And even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that he knows, that somehow he's still there, still watching, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. And that's what scares me the most. Even though I've moved out, even though I've tried to keep my distance between us, the fear won't leave me. I lock the doors, I check the windows, I keep the lights on at night. But no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that he's still here, lurking in the shadows of my life that I can't get rid of. Sometimes I think about showing the tapes to my parents, telling them everything. But then I think about the consequences, about how it would affect my family, and I hesitate. I'm afraid, not just of him, but of what the truth might do, how it might destroy everything we've built. So I keep it inside of me. I carry the weight of it every day, the fear, the anger, the helplessness. I try to move on, to live my life, but he's always there in the back of my mind. I see him at family gatherings, his eyes meeting mine across the room, the same crooked smile on his face, and I wonder if he knows that I know. I wonder if he's waiting for the day when I finally speak, when I finally bring everything into the light. Until then, I live with the realization that the person who was supposed to protect me, who was supposed to be my family, is the one I fear the most. It's not just the memory of what he did that scares me, but the possibility that he could still be doing it, that somewhere out there he's still watching, still waiting, and that's a fear I don't know how to get rid of.